Okay. So I run with some other friends and colleagues in Bangladesh, a very, very tiny architecture research design studio. As you can hear from my voice, I'm very English, so I was raised here, studied here, and then I went back to Bangladesh around 2009, met some friends, and we decided that we wanted to do something a bit different. So we set up a studio called Para. So Para just means neighborhood or a small hamlet in Bangla. And our idea was to look at it beyond architecture, so looking at architecture beyond. I'll try and keep the presentation relatively short. So I'll talk a little bit about who we are and a little bit of how we've been collaborating, and I'll explain that through a couple of different projects. And then I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing in the coming future. It's mostly pictures, so it's not too dense. And Niklas has given us a very good conversation about what Bangladesh is, so I don't really need to repeat this, but not so dissimilar in terms of understanding the impacts of the environment and sort of water on Bangladesh. A lot of our projects has not yet gone into scales that Niklas has explained so far, but we're beginning to think a little bit more about where we are as a practice. So it's our small studio, and a lot of our work has been involving working with vulnerable groups. So some of them have been homeless children, some have been homeless women, others have been people that have lived in refugee camps, and along with just people in general, but and also artisans and communities outside of Dhaka. So one of the first things that we did when we were trying to understand Bangladesh, and I was trying to understand Bangladesh, was looking at how young people live and function on a daily basis in a particular settlement. So this was a protracted refugee camp, so a settlement that's been a refugee camp from 1975, but it's no longer a refugee camp, but it still very much functions like an informal settlement. So we tried to understand really just how does a child in that camp do their homework, and we wanted to understand how they navigate the camp and how they live in the camp and how do they get to school and how far is the school. So it was a bigger study, but what it showed us was that there's a lot of vulnerabilities that architects need to address when it comes to designing for and with communities in Bangladesh. And as we continue sort of our work, one of the things that we did was we designed a pavement dweller center, which I don't know if Niklas, if you had a chance to see or not, a couple of years ago. And we worked with the users in this particular project, and one of the interesting finds that we had within that whole project was, if you look at sort of the plan that they had developed with us, where you see sort of the wash routine, the bathroom, they wanted that to be as important as the rest of the building. And so we ended up developing a lot of bathroom units for the boys, for the girls, for the kids, for the women. So it's a mixed-use center. And one of the challenges that we had with this project was to convince the client to listen to the needs of the users rather than what the client had in mind. So it was a very big charity. And we ended up taking down a building that they had already constructed to reconstruct what we were suggesting was a more suitable project. And along the same time, we also worked with a very nice artisan who talked about motifs in and sort of weaving cultures in Bangladesh. So the door of this building was then embezzled with motifs that these women had developed with us. And this is sort of a mixed-use center near the railway station, sort of heart of downtown Dhaka. It functions as a day care as well as a training space for women, as well as just a rest space for women. And one of the most interesting things is that it has a little, at the back of it, I have a picture of it. At the back of it, there's cleaning facilities for women to bring their clothes and wash and dry and cook, and then go back to wherever they've come from. So it's aimed primarily at women who are at most risk in downtown near the railway station. And while they're working, their kids can be given an education and meal. And we tried, and one of the challenges we had in this building was to work with recycled materials. I think it's quite a romanticized notion to go out there and build with things that are broken and waste materials and things like that. One of the challenges we had was trying to convince the client that that was the way forward. There's lots of recycled material depots around the city. And we did a lot of scoping work, we found out ways to do it. And so the tiled facade there was really funny because the contractor ended up buying brand new tiles and then smashing them. So it's just really interesting for us to look at it from a construction perspective. How do we educate the people that we want to work with in terms of the construction workers for them to actually, hey, look, it's okay. Go get some broken tiles and it's fine. You can use them and just put them back in. It was just really fascinating that they went and brought brand new boxes of tiles and smashed them. And we just sort of thought, that was not what we've been talking to. We spent months arguing with them about this, and in the end they did this. So I think, and it was, for us it was a really interesting project because the wider situation in Dhaka, for example, in terms of homelessness and people living on the streets or very challenging settlements, is there are no surveys, there are no services that are designed for that. So when we were working with this charity, we ended up looking beyond just the architecture, and then we did an evaluation of the project to understand actually what is the needs of the project itself and beyond just the building. And what's happened is we've been sort of working alongside the charity with other friends and colleagues to understand actually what we then as a studio look at as potential interventions in the future. And so just recently, and I'll try and quickly go through this, but just recently this summer, or last month, August, I was there with a bunch of designers in Dhaka, and we did a relatively eclectic theatrical parade, but which worked with theatre groups, homeless women, and fashion students. So the role of the architect is quite diminished here, but we were trying to navigate the city from a very different prism. And we ended up doing a performance of what we had developed through the station. So this is the railway station, one of the largest transit points in Dhaka. And the lady in green, who was a resident of the station, was performing to the station visitors, I guess, at that point, about the issues of vulnerability that she faces as a woman in that site. And this is at the National Theatre space, and then we did a parade through the university complex. And so just going back, so what we've sort of been learning is the role of the architect has to really be a bit more fluid. So we're sort of going with the environment and understanding the human environment as much as the built environment. And a lot of our work has been to challenge the conceptions of how people are perceived, but also then to challenge the architect in how they perceive these particular communities. And another project that we've sort of been working with is a small children's charity across now maybe 5 years, where we looked at how children, especially very young, vulnerable children, some of the pictures that Nicholas showed of big river with the ferries, etc. We did a project near there. So this is the river. So this is the river. So see the boats, and this was a participatory map that we did with the children. And we asked them a couple of questions about where they sort of sleep, where they play, where they work, and where they feel is very dangerous. And this is in a very, very busy part of the old town, and it's completely commercial kind of hub. So where you sort of see the children here, they were saying that they sleep on the port and they have to sleep together. Otherwise, they might get raped, they might get abused, and they get beaten up. And one of the sort of the anecdotes that I sort of took away from this was that the red dots at the top right corner, if you can see, is where the police are. And that's where they highlighted as the most abusive of the sites in that area. And where the blue is where they all work, and the other thing was they have to pay to go into these small public parks that exist. So it's a token payment, but when a child is there and they don't have any money, 2p or 3p is a lot of money. And so it's really interesting then that they were not even having access to these public parks that were designed for them in the first place. And so it gave us a lot of insights into what some of these children were thinking and doing, and having an understanding their perception of space. So one of the things they had said was that they did not want to be in a closed space. So the charity that we were working with at the time, this particular project, no longer exists, but it was a transition space that was for this charity to rescue children from these sites and house them for a short while whilst they were being either rehabilitated or taken back home, back to their respective homes if they so deemed. So the challenge for us at the time was just to understand, what do we as architects do in this kind of situation in terms of design? And is there anything that we can do? Because the problem is such that it's much bigger than the architecture actually. So in the end, we didn't really do anything other than this facade, which was very open. And right across it is one of the busiest bridges in Dhaka. So it's a very loud and very, very dense kind of space. So we were already very cautious that actually the site that the client had was a very dangerous space because it was not going to give them adequate shelter and support. And just noise pollution is going to be a big thing. And continuing on in terms of the way we've been thinking about the way we work as a studio has been very much grounded around the ethics of architecture and sort of the ethics of participation and involvement of the people that are going to be developing. And I think one of the things that Oliver talked a lot about is what's happening in Lewis and a lot of the maker spaces that are emerging, or a lot of the smaller craft-based projects that are emerging. One of the challenges that we've had in Bangladesh is that doing that is quite a privileged space to be able to do that, to be able to stop and make it a nice, beautiful space. So a lot of the conversations we've had have been around dignity and agriculture and environment. So this was the same charity, and we developed instead of so the client wanted a chicken farm where we designed a play garden. So when we said, hey, we're not going to work with you to design a chicken farm, but which was just a couple hundred chickens in this plot of land that was given. But we instead would like to ask the children, so there's 45 children living in the shelter, what they would like. And what they said is they wanted a theatre space, a space where they could perform and things to grow. So very hands-on, very tactile, very performance-based. And so we ended up working with architecture students to understand how we can do this. And this is a very short video that I think I'll pass on. But you can sort of see this garden that was done.
Oh,
Do you explain? Oh, sorry. Sorry. So, through our sort of work on the ground, we've been learning a lot that actually all of the ingredients that exist to make interesting communal spaces or communal projects requires a giant amount of re-education from an architectural perspective, and specifically then in Bangladesh. And what we've been doing then is, and one of the projects in Niklas's book is we've developed a training and method to sort of really relook at the wider scope of what's going on in Bangladesh in terms of the ethics, the politics, and the environmental issues, but also then the potential of architecture and also then design to influence and shape some of those discourses. And so this was the garden right behind that we did a few years ago. We continued on that project with the charity. And bizarrely, a lot of the politics, as Niklas was saying, it's all around land. So this entire neighborhood was a floodplain, has been infilled with sand over the last couple of years, and in about 5 years' time, it will become a big, bustling kind of residential unit just on the other side of the river in Dhaka. But what's interesting is that the charity was able to negotiate with the landowner behind to offer the site as a playground for the children that's there, but also for the local children in the area. And we worked quite very closely then with bamboo and to understand the potential of bamboo to be a new material for us to play with and for the children to also play with. I'm sorry, the picture's very dark. We worked quite closely then over a very short period, only possibly 2 weeks, because we understood the challenges of having people over there, but also then the intensity of building was also problematic. And it was getting to the point of rainy season, so we had to try and avoid the rains coming. And so we ended up designing with architecture students and the children of the center this quite wacky kind of relatively unbuildable kind of structure. And then we set the task of saying, let's build it. And we did this across maybe 10 days. Looking at it in that kind of process of making and doing, we had to ask a lot of questions to the architecture students and the architects that were involved in the project about, again, the ethics of doing this in the first place. And every time we sort of go back to the way we are working, we've been sort of applying two different lenses to our work. One is the architectural, the designer lens, or the expert lens. But the other has been just a very human lens and saying, can we have a human conversation about a space or a place or a project? And can we make that happen? And how do we make that happen? And how do we talk in a language where there's such massive class barriers and also gender barriers? And so this project sort of still exists, and we're going to be taking it down to rebuild it and rebuild it a little bit bigger. But it became a performance space, a play space, both for the children that are there, but also then the wider community that's there as well. And so one of the challenges was to say this is a public. We have sort of so we have a good kind of understanding of what public space is from a UK perspective, but I think in Bangladesh we've had this interesting conversation around what can be public. And so going forward, what we've learned is that we as a studio need to be much more rigorous about institutionalizing some of our thinking in Bangladesh. And so we've developed a new design research framework that we're going to be teaching starting from next year that looks at sort of justice and process and impact in terms of a grounded reality of what is going on in the architectural world. And we will be doing it through live projects, so including the Bamboo project. And what we're hoping is then to have a wider collaboration globally in the future, but really focusing in on young architecture students in Bangladesh and inviting them to come and work with us on projects so they can learn through a hands-on experience what it means to be doing sensitive and vulnerable architectural works in the country of Bangladesh. So, thank you.